Thank you for joining us today. I'm Megan Doherty, the director of the Museum of the White Mountains. As we gather today, we're all on Indigenous lands. Those of us at the Museum of the White Mountains are on Indakina, which is the ancestral and present homelands of the Abenaki and Wabanaki peoples. We're grateful for their stewardship of these lands and waterways. For those of you on Zoom, we've put some links in the chat where you can learn more about the Indigenous histories of your place at native-land.ca, as well as the Abenaki peoples of Northern New England through the Musée des Abenaki in Quebec. And if you haven't already, be sure to have a look at the exhibition upstairs if you're here in person, or come and see us before Saturday, September 14th. That will be the closing of this exhibition. And if you aren't already planning to join us, please do come by between 1 and 3 on Saturday. We have an amazing opportunity where Annette Nolette, the basket maker whose work is upstairs in the exhibition, is coming down from Odanak to give a demonstration, and her nephew Luke Nolette is coming down to demonstrate ash pounding. So that will be here at the museum 1 to 3 on Saturday the 14th. So to kick off this semester's Spotlight on Humanities and Sustainability Studies lecture series, I'm delighted to be joined by Sam Evans-Brown. Sam leads Clean Energy New Hampshire in its efforts to create a cleaner, more affordable, and more resilient energy system in the Granite State. Prior to joining Clean Energy New Hampshire in 2021, he was a radio journalist with New Hampshire Public Radio for nearly 10 years, during which time he was the founding host of one of the station's first podcasts, Outside In, and answered listeners' environmental questions every other Friday on the Ask Sam segment. This event is supported by a Spotlight on the Humanities and Sustainability Studies grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Please join me in welcoming Sam.
Point of this talk is really to be sort of an antidote to pessimism, and I encounter a lot of pessimism in my day-to-day life. And I, in fact, even encounter it a lot on my staff, who are folks who are really, up to their eyeballs in these issues. And I think it can be easy to be pessimistic about climate change. And it can be sometimes hard to pull back the camera and see how far we've come. I think there's a lot of reason for optimism, and I try to infuse that in my comings and goings wherever I go. And so that's really what this is. It's kind of my id is what is in this talk. It's not to say that we should be Pollyanna about the challenges that confront us, but really I think that the optimistic side of the story is one that gets underrepresented. So that's what this is really all about. Very briefly, Clean Energy New Hampshire. So I came to Clean Energy New Hampshire as executive director because when this job opened, I could not have imagined having left my other job for anything other than this position. So after 10 years of being an environmental journalist, I became very convinced that the problem, the climate problem, really was an energy problem, and that the nexus for action really was local. And so that's what Clean Energy New Hampshire is we're an organization that's focused largely on trying to transform New Hampshire's policy landscape for clean energy, and we work exclusively within the borders of New Hampshire, sometimes even to the detriment of our organization, because some decisions are made regionally. We're part of a regional electric grid, and it's governed by a regional entity, but we don't get involved down there because what I see is a crowded field of advocacy, whereas in New Hampshire I see a sort of barren field, and think that there's a lot of impact that we can have here locally. And even though the climate space is getting a little more busy, it's still nothing like all of our surrounding states. There's a thriving climate advocacy ecosystem in every other state in New England, and in New Hampshire, it's still very nascent. So that's what we're working on, local clean energy policy. And particularly, we are working on trying to be an organization that speaks across differences of ideology. Our Republican friends are not always the easiest to work with, but we are able to get substantial support for the types of policies that we advance amongst particularly local Republican lawmakers. And again, that's a story that I think doesn't get told enough. So if you're interested, I slapped that QR code. That's our annual report that we just put out. You'll find more about the organization there. But that's not what we're here to talk about. So if people do want to look at it, you can find it at that spot. And otherwise, I'm going to keep going. These are our mission vision principles. This is probably sort of more than you need to know, but this is what we work on and how we work. Oh yeah, and I'll sort of swim through all these. We have members. These are some of our members. We have business members. We have municipal members. This map actually needs to be updated. We're up to around 50 municipal members that work with us in coalition to try to advance our various priorities. And now into the talk. So I like to start with what we know already, which is climate change is a really, really, really serious problem. We have to do something about it. So this is Our World in Data, which is one of my favorite sources for really compelling charts and graphs. 2023 was the hottest year on record. 2024 is on track to be hotter still. And in particular, that lends itself to really bad extreme weather events, mostly in the Northeast. What we're talking about is extreme inundation events. So you know, 8 inches of rain in an hour is the sort of classic Northeastern climate impact. It's really simple as to why that would be. A hotter atmosphere contains more water, and it all drops at the same time. For some reason, it seems to all drop in like the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. Someone should answer to me why that seems to keep happening over and over. But that's, you know, that's the reason that we really need to work on this. The thing that I think, the impact that scares me the most globally, and the one that I think maybe gets for years and years was sort of undersold, is really extreme heat. This is a kind of scary graph. So has anyone heard the term wet bulb temperature? Okay, so we've got a couple of wet bulb enthusiasts here. A wet bulb, if you don't know the origin of that term, that's if you were to take a thermometer, wrap it in a wet towel, and swing it around your head, right? So the wet towel mimics a sweaty body and the work that sweat does, evaporating to cool you off. And so a wet bulb that has evaporating moisture on it will cool more quickly and will have a lower temperature, versus if you're in a really humid environment and you can't, you know, evaporation doesn't work very well, the wet bulb temperature is higher. And that's a real good measure of what's dangerous heat as opposed to just hot heat. And so these are projections of wet bulb temperature in 2050 and 2100 that exceed the threshold of dangerous. And by dangerous, it means hot enough outside that it will kill you if you're outside for an extended period of time. And this is the different maps are different scenarios that are mapped under the IPCC. And so you see on like the really scariest one on the bottom right, you know, over 300 days per year that the outdoor wet bulb temperature exceed the dangerous threshold in certain parts of the globe. And what's really scary about a map like this is that really that's a measure of habitability. You know, you start to get to scenarios in the worst case scenarios where you're talking about large swaths of people moving away from those parts of the globe to go live elsewhere, and the, you know, the types of social impacts that you see associated with people making those moves more than anything. Now, here's the part where I pivot away from the doom and gloom narrative that you hear and start to get somewhat optimistic, because I think that that's the type of thing that people hear a lot and get quite scared by, and then sort of shut down. And you'll have to forgive me, but I'm going to get a little bit nerdy for a little bit here, and I hope you'll hang with me for it. So these are scenarios from the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. So whenever you read about, you know, we have to get to 1.5 degrees by 20, you know, or stay under 1.5 degrees or stay under 2 degrees, those recommendations all come from the IPCC, and those recommendations are based on these scenarios. The 8.5 is the worst case scenario, and 4.5 is the best case scenario, and then there's a couple others in between. The thing that's important to know about these is that in order to get to each of these scenarios, there's a certain amount of concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that you have to get to in order for these things to happen. In order to get to those concentrations of greenhouse gases, this is what you'd have to do. So again, really a messy chart, but I will try to explain it to you. The one on the far right, SSP5, corresponds with the red line on this previous graph. And the one on the far left, SSP1, corresponds with the best case scenario on this graph. So the takeaway that I would give you from this kind of messy chart is look at essentially how much coal and oil need to be burned to get to that worst case scenario. When you read the literature on this, which I had to do as a reporter at my previous job, in order to get to that level of concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, you have to do things that are literally crazy, that we will never do. In order to model that, we not only mine every ounce of coal out of the crust of the earth that we can get to, but we do things like gasify it and put it into cars to drive transportation. And that's the kind of economic modeling that they do to get to the RCP 8.5 worst case scenario. We are not going to do those things, and we are not on track to do those things. There's a story that I think does not get told enough, is that we are nowhere near that worst case scenario. And so if we go back a couple slides, right? So here's the really, really scary slide. Here's like the Amazon rainforest is essentially uninhabitable in 2100. That's based on RCP 8.5. That's not going to happen. We are headed towards a world that is hotter than today, but is not going to get that hot. So where are we headed? Sorry, this is just sort of another view of that other graph. These are the things you'd have to do. So here's a better sense of where we're actually headed based on what we know. So the red is the sort of cone of uncertainty. We're in hurricane season here. So if you imagine those hurricane spaghetti charts, the red is our hurricane cone of uncertainty. Just based on, so you see the 2030 NDCs. NDCs are nationally determined contributions. That's when you hear about the Paris climate talks. That's what everyone went to Paris and said, here's what we're going to do, is we're going to do these things. Those are the NDCs. Net zero pledges on top of that are non-binding pledges that have been put forth by entities that weren't at the Paris talks. So that includes, my town, Concord, New Hampshire, Hanover, New Hampshire, that have a 100% clean energy by 2030 or 2050 goal. As well as corporate entities that have their own corporate climate pledges. If you layer those on top, you get those other bars of uncertainty there on the right. And so there's on the right, you have your degrees of warming. So we're headed for a world somewhere between 3 degrees and 1.5 degrees of warming. Now, what does that mean for the graphs before? So when we went to so if you look at these worst case scenario, or these various scenarios that the IPCC laid out, the red bar is not 3 degrees. It's more like 8 degrees warming. And those are where you start to see predictions of like the end of civilization as we know it. So we are much more in line. We're somewhere in between the yellow and the orange bar right now. So bad, yes. But whenever you see a headline that makes you think civilization is going to end, that is not supported by science. Where we're headed is actually somewhere in between that very, very, very scary outcome and being on a glide path towards 1.5 degrees cooling. So why is that? And the answer is because we are making tremendous progress already that goes underreported. So what drives that progress? Here in New Hampshire, I have a bias. I think that much of the progress is happening because of policies passed on the local level. And so I'm going to run really quickly through some of the policies that are already in place in New Hampshire that are making an impact today. And I'm going to do them in sort of chronological order as to when they were passed. So the first is our ratepayer funded energy efficiency programs. The cheapest thing you can do to eliminate emissions is not emit in the first place. So it was one of my favorite graphs down here on the bottom left, the levelized costs by resource. So you see energy efficiency, you see the utility scale, wind and solar, you see combined cycle natural gas. Of all of the various things that you can build to generate electricity today, the cheapest thing you can do is to avoid building any of those things by swapping out something that uses electricity and put in something that uses less. The classic example of this is the LED light bulb. Putting in an LED light bulb has just an absolutely killer return on investment these days in terms of how cheap they are. An LED light bulb replacing an incandescent light bulb has a less than a 1-year payback at this point. So it used to be, it would say, oh, when your light bulbs die, swap it out for an LED. At this point, don't. if you have an incandescent light bulb left in your house, swap it out right now. There's no reason for you to still have them. And so when you look at the energy efficiency programs, the reason that we passed these in New Hampshire, they started in about 1998, is because essentially if you're a utility, you have two options. One is you let demand grow out of control and you build more power lines, transformers, power plants in order to meet that demand, in which case you're paying, prices down on the bottom end of this graph, or you invest strategically in energy efficiency to avoid having to build those power lines, transformers, power plants. And time again, the analysis has shown that spending money on energy efficiency instead of spending money on new infrastructure pays for itself. And so that is why we take a little bit of money off of everybody's electric bill. It's about 0.5 cents per kilowatt hour right now. And we create these incentive programs for you to pursue energy efficiency. If you have not already, go to newhampshiresaves.com tomorrow and see what's available for you, because there are incentives for everyone, including for folks who don't own their homes. The second, which passed in 1998, bipartisan duo passed this bill, is net metering. So net metering is the policy that you might have heard about. It's been in the news again lately. And my favorite story about this is that net metering came about because of a guy named Stephen Strong, who's an architect down in Massachusetts. And Stephen is in the late 70s, wanted to put PV, photovoltaic panels, on the roof of a public housing complex in Quincy, Massachusetts that was getting built. And at that point, it was so expensive that it was absurd. Now you can get just the equipment to do photovoltaic at about $1 per watt. And at that time, it was like $150 a watt. So an order of magnitude more expensive than it is today. And he put this relatively modest array on the roof of this public housing complex. And he was like, I think that if I have these panels and they're generating in DC, and if I put an inverter that switches the DC to AC, and if I just plug it into the meter that usually just goes this way, the wheel on a stick that goes this way when you're buying electricity, I think it'll just go the other way. And he was an electrical engineer, and so he ran this by the folks at the utility. And at that time it was NSTAR, and they came in and they were just like, yeah, whatever, just make it work. The ribbon cutting is tomorrow, and Jimmy Carter's going to be there. And so thus net metering was born, and it spread through this sort of whisper network throughout the states, and it created the early market for residential solar. And we've had it in New Hampshire since 1998. In 2017, we cut the net metering rate. So if you see the wheel on the bottom right, we used to get the full wheel, the full retail rate of electricity back whenever you sold. Now, when you export, anything you consume, the joke is what happens behind the meter stays behind the meter. So whatever you consume in your house, obviously the utility doesn't get to keep that. But if you export anything to the grid at the end of the month, your credit has been cut a little bit, which happened in 2017. So net metering, we still have it in New Hampshire. It's kind of under threat as we speak, but that's been around since 1998. The third is our friend Reggie. So raise your hand if you knew that you're paying a carbon tax here in New England as we speak. So one hand went up. This has been passed. This was passed in 2007. Governor John Lynch signed this bill. I think my map is up to date. There are a couple states that come in and out of Reggie, depending on the politics of their state. Pennsylvania and Virginia, in particular, have been sort of drifting in and out. It's a cap and trade bill. This was a design that was really popular following the George H.W. Bush administration. For those who remember H.W. Bush, he ran on a platform of environmentalism and said, anyone who's heard of the greenhouse effect hasn't heard about the White House effect, and said he was going to deal with climate change. And one of the things that they did was they passed amendments to the Clean Air Act that instituted a cap and trade program for sulfur and nitrous oxides. Which, if you haven't heard about acid rain lately, it's because those laws were so effective that we've dramatically reduced the emissions of those two pollutants and have effectively nipped the problem of acid rain in the bud. And so these cap and trade programs were all based on that design. It's like, we're going to create a market for pollution, and we're going to let people trade pollution credits on that open market and find the cheapest and most efficient way to get rid of the pollution. It's a policy design that a little bit is going out of favor, but it was the mid-aughts, and that's what we were doing. So we are paying a regional price on carbon. that is assessed only to power plants. This doesn't apply to your, the gasoline in your car, doesn't apply to a cement factory or any other industrial use. It's just power plants that we pay that carbon tax, but it is meaningfully driving fossil fuels out of the market. So if you look right now at what are the new power plants that are being proposed for New England, they are 98% wind, solar, and batteries. No one is proposing, there's a single expansion of a small natural gas plant down in Massachusetts that is being proposed currently. But other than that one single plant, no one is proposing to build new fossil fuel fired infrastructure in New England. And the last piece is our renewable portfolio standard, of which New Hampshire has the worst in the region and is sort of like laughably low at this point. However, this provides an additional boost to any renewable energy product. Again, this is one of these sort of market-based programs that were in vogue. This was passed in 2008, so right after Reggie under John Lynch. And it created a market-based mechanism to require utilities to buy renewable energy credits, and those credits provide an additional sort of $20 to $30 per megawatt hour for anybody who's generating renewable electricity. So we have a small but meaningful renewable portfolio standard in New Hampshire that's been helpful. I will note it caps out in 2025, and that's next year. So expect to hear about the renewable portfolio standard again in the news, because I think we'll be arguing about it at the legislature. And the last one, most recent, is community power. So community power passed in 2019. In 2021, the rules that govern community power were actually promulgated through the Public Utilities Commission. And in 2020, excuse me, 2023, I guess, communities started to launch their aggregations. And what this is right now we have a deregulated electricity system. So you can go, tomorrow or tonight if you want, and you can decide where you want to purchase your electricity from, and you don't have to take the electricity mix that your utility is providing for you. That's been in place since 1998. Again, it was sort of the same bipartisan duo that pursued net metering that got that done. What community power acknowledges, though, is that most people don't do that. It's really confusing to shop for your own electricity. There's sort of it's kind of shark-infested waters out there. There are really bad actors in the sort of for-profit energy broker space, and they can sign you into these contracts that are really unhelpful. And so for a long time, residential customers in particular weren't taking advantage of it. Bigger customers, so commercial and industrial customers, have been doing this for decades and have been getting cheaper electricity as a result. But residential customers haven't. 80% have stayed on the utility default service. Community power says your town can aggregate everybody in that town together and use the collective buying power of all the residents and go to market to get you a better deal. It's already saving people money just based on that idea alone. But then the second part of that is your town, if you want, can pursue purchasing clean electricity on your behalf as a collective unit. So of the 60 some odd communities that have launched community power aggregations, there's a small handful that have increased the ambition of how much clean power they want to purchase and are getting more like 30% renewable energy as opposed to the state mandated 19% in our renewable portfolio standard. So it's a mechanism to use to sort of go around the intransigence at the state government and try to use local power to advance a clean energy agenda. So I want to add a slide showing at some point the fact that we actually have made substantial progress in New Hampshire. And I always forget to do it before putting the slideshow up. But New Hampshire is the state that has had the largest drop in our carbon emissions of any state in the United States. It's a somewhat complicated story because it's not just because of those policies I put up. It's mostly because we closed our coal plants and we had a whole bunch of coal plants, and the market forces have essentially driven coal out of the market. But part of what drives the market is that framework that we just laid out. So those are the policies that we've already got in place. The next section here is why I think the next 10 years, things are going to accelerate much faster than anybody has really been expecting. So, well, first of all, why don't we know that? Why isn't it just in the water that all of this is happening? And I would argue that there's a fairly robust misinformation ecosystem that is invested in making sure that you think that all these solutions are garbage. And in particular, what I've observed is what's shown in this chart, which is that folks that are concerned about us moving away from fossil fuels have shifted strategy and have stopped saying, oh, no, climate change is not a thing, it's not real. And instead have shifted to saying, yeah, okay, climate change may be real, but those electric vehicles sure are trash, aren't they? And so this trend of attacking the solutions and suggesting that they're not fit to purpose is part of why I think folks are very glum about the solutions that we have already that are ready to deploy right now. And the thing that I find most disheartening about this is I hear a lot of those misinformation talking points being sort of parroted by the folks that shouldn't really have fallen for them. And my favorite example of this is recently we had an event. So New Hampshire got a bunch of money from the EPA to deploy 79 electric school buses in the state of New Hampshire. We had a big event to celebrate that down in Concord. It's actually my 6-year-old's kindergarten was where the event was held, which I was really excited about. And then the next day, someone sent me a bunch of next door posts that was a bunch of people I know who are environmentalists talking about the travesty of the fact that those batteries in those buses are full of cobalt, which are mined by slaves, which is completely untrue because the electric vehicle industry has pivoted very quickly away from nickel, manganese, cobalt batteries and is now doing lithium iron phosphate batteries that don't have any nickel or cobalt in them. So it's completely false, but many well-meaning environmentalists are sort of repeating that false talking point because they're well-meaning environmentalists. So this is a trend. Okay, sorry. This is the next point. Then one thing there, but another very confusing chart. But again, what I think is a sort of underappreciated point. So this is a chart of levelized cost of energy, which is to say, if you needed to pay someone to build a power plant tomorrow, how much would it cost for you to pay them to build that power plant, based on the type of technology that they're hoping to deploy. And the thing that I want to pull out from this chart is this. So the yellow line is solar, the blue line is wind. It is especially in the parts of the world where the wind and solar resource are the best, these are now the cheapest form of energy that we have ever had in human history. The reason that there's a perception, in my opinion, that wind and solar are expensive is because there's a lot of capital cost involved in purchasing these. You're buying 25 years worth of fuel up front, and we're just not used to doing that. So what we've done is we've taken fuel costs and we've swapped it for financing costs. And particularly in a high interest rate environment where we are now, it's very difficult for people to wrap their brains around that. But it is a fact that when you look at the all-in costs, so the cost of building the thing, the cost of capital, the cost of maintenance, the cost of the fuel, they are the cheapest resources out there. That is another part of the reason why, when you look at what's being proposed for New England right now, 98% wind, solar, and batteries. This is I slapped this in here just because I like the phrase. There was this thing that people used to say when silicon chips, microchips were starting to come down the cost curve, that computing was getting so cheap and efficient that they're saying, oh, software is eating the world. And this was like the 90s tech boom. Similarly, folks are saying, oh, now solar is eating the world because it's getting so cheap so fast. So these are capacity additions, and these are global numbers. So we can talk about how that's different locally in a bit. But the point is that we are currently deploying wind and solar globally faster than we have ever deployed any type of energy resource again in human history. Right. And this is one of these, in my world, I see this every day. And I can tell you about the New Hampshire story, but I find it very frustrating that this is not something that is broken through to sort of the public consciousness. That's kind of the same point in the same graph or in a different graph. And then there's once again, that's global solar additions. There's 2023, and this is a slide that I could actually probably update now because I think we've passed estimated numbers, and then we may now have estimated numbers for 2024. And sort of surprise, 2024 is still on track to be another record-breaking year. So The same is happening in New Hampshire. I think we have tended to be frustrated in New Hampshire because our neighboring states are deploying much more quickly than we are. But we're not necessarily a slouch when you look at the national picture. You look at solar capacity per capita nationwide, we're about 16th in the country. So it's not like we're not Mississippi. We're doing better than many places. And I can tell you because of the membership of Clean Energy New Hampshire and because of the way that we work, that there's nothing but upside to come. So currently, there are what are called interconnection queues. So these are when you want to build a project, you ask for permission to connect to the grid. And there's two different grids. There's the low voltage distribution grid that are the local utilities, and there's the high voltage transmission grid that big projects would connect to. In just in Eversource's territory alone, so Eversource is the biggest utility in New Hampshire, there's 500 megawatts of solar that have entered the interconnection queue, which if you look at this graph, if all those projects were to get built, we would double the amount of solar in the state of New Hampshire next year. Now, there are a lot of challenges to those projects getting built. We're probably not going to build all of them, but that is what is knocking on the door right now, trying to happen. And that's just those projects cut off at 5 megawatts, which those are not big projects. 5 megawatts is kind of what you would put on like a capped landfill in order to fill in, do like infill development in a local space. The bigger projects, the utility scale projects, there's another 1,000 megawatts sitting in the ISO New England queue that are trying to connect to the high voltage transmission grid just in the state of New Hampshire. So there's a huge amount of renewable energy development that is trying to happen right now, and this is just the beginning. So. This is kind of the point I was making before. This is a very, very simple graph. We can go right past it. But this is when you do the math, this is just the math for a very small 5 kilowatt rooftop solar array. The utility electricity column right there on the right is just a very basic forecast of how much we expect electricity to cost coming from your utility over the course of the next 30 years. And then over those 30 years, how much does the cost per kilowatt hour of production map to that utility cost? So over 30 years, the cost of putting solar on your rooftop is about 7 cents per kilowatt hour. And is unsubsidized. There's no subsidies built into this. Versus 28 cents per kilowatt hour buying from the utility. So many people will say, oh, but you're going to need batteries, you're going to need, and my answer would be, well, batteries might be more expensive than solar alone, but when you've got something that is 4 times cheaper than grid electricity, that's a lot of overhead to build in some of those other reliability solutions that we might need. Okay, so also EVs. We at this point now have 2 electric vehicles in our house. We've gotten rid of all the gas cars. I can tell you that it's pretty normal driving one, and after a month or so, you kind of forget that what it used to be like to drive a gas car. The reason that I'm really bullish on EVs is really just this graph right here. So what this shows is if you had those, US daily consumption of gas, so 8.9 million barrels per day of gasoline, where does the energy from that barrel of gasoline go? When you put it into a gas car, 80% of it is just lost to the world. It's the block getting hot, it's the exhaust getting hot, it's hot air coming out the back of the car. It's just the tremendous inefficiency of an internal combustion engine, where most of that combustion does not translate directly into motion down the road, which is what we actually want. If you were to take a coal-fired power plant and burn that, the equivalent of those 8.9 million barrels of gasoline, you actually still get a reasonably efficient vehicle, because a single coal-fired power plant, instead of losing 80% of the atmosphere, only loses 67% of the atmosphere, and then the energy to the wheels is the remainder there, essentially around 15%. But then when you start to green the grid and go to more efficient fuels in the grid, you start to get dramatically more efficient energy conversions to the vehicle. So hydropower, there is no combustion. There is no smokestack where you're losing anything up into the atmosphere. And you start to look at a system that 90 some odd percent of the energy is being translated into the actual service that you're looking for, as opposed to being waste heat. And this is one of my there's this thing called the primary energy fallacy, where people say, oh, look at how much fossil fuel we burn. And they look at the global use of fossil fuel and they say, if we were to replace all this with renewable energy, we need to do blah. And they do a very simple conversion, but they don't factor any of this in. They don't factor in the fact that 60 some odd percent of the energy from the fossil fuels that we burn, we simply lose to the atmosphere every year. So the reality is that electrification is efficiency. And that if we were to electrify large parts of our economy, we would need 60%-ish less energy globally by transitioning to these fuels. And I think that's going to drive the economics of EVs for some time to come. So what does that mean? That means that right now on today's grid, so just plugging into the grid, you don't have to have any of your own renewable energy on your house or anything like that, but just plugging into the wall, we're currently driving on the equivalent of 111 miles per gallon for an EV. And so whenever somebody says, oh, that EV is just being fueled by the coal plant, it's just like, well, just do the math and you'll see that, like, yeah, that is to a degree true. The grid is fossil fueled by some percentage, but it's already dramatically cleaner than just fueling up a car. And as the grid gets cleaner, these numbers will rise too. And then just the economics. And so I did this. I think this math is still pretty good. Did anybody see, like, what's the cost of a gallon of gas right now at a gas station? Because I know it was going down. $2.90, right? So I did this at the beginning of the summer. So $2.90 is, it's a little high, but this, again, rough general numbers, these were real numbers when I used them at the beginning of the summer. So about 19 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity. That was what Eversource was supplying with, again, at the beginning of the summer. I think that's still the same. And then $3.50 a gallon. You're driving per mile for about half the cost with an electric vehicle. And it's just going to get better. So I know EVs are expensive, although it's funny, I was looking at Consumer Reports just yesterday. Regular cars are expensive now too. This was not something that was on my bingo card. I thought, like, EVs will get cheaper. I did not assume that every car is going to cost $35,000, which seems to be about where we're at right now. Battery prices, and actually this is another one that I could update. Battery prices cratered this summer. We're now seeing battery prices at less than $100 per kilowatt hour, which no one was expecting we were going to get to until 2030. So that hasn't started to shake itself out through the supply chain yet, but in the next year or two, you're going to see EV prices falling even farther. And you can see there's the 1 year of the COVID supply chain shock, is that 1 year black bar where battery prices rose just a tiny bit. And the response has been pretty much what you'd expect. So this has been pretty widely reported at this point that China's building electric vehicles that are $10,000 for a car that's got 300 plus miles of range. And the fact that we haven't figured out how to do that yet does not mean that we're not going to in the very near future. And in those places that have figured this out, 40% of new vehicle sales are now electric. There was actually, I think I can share this. So there was a delegation that came from China on sort of like an economic mission. They came and visited Clean Energy New Hampshire, and we had a conversation. And they're speaking through a translator, and they said to me, "We've noticed that there's not many electric cars here. What's wrong with New Hampshire?" And I had to sort of walk them through the political and cultural history of EVs in the United States a little bit. And again, this is happening in New Hampshire. So we've had 40% year-over-year growth in the number of EVs on the road. And you've probably seen it. They're out there. There are more of them than I think people are realizing. There's now, if you count plug-in hybrids and EVs, there's over 10,000 of them on the road registered in New Hampshire without any meaningful incentive other than the federal tax credits, which are a huge pain in the butt to get. So, and this is, I can't stress this one enough. Used EVs are a thing now. Of the two EVs that we bought, one of them is a used 2013 Nissan Leaf, which we jokingly refer to as the car on a leash. It was less than, it was $7,000 for a car with 50,000 miles on it. and we use it as our around town car. We can get up here from Concord in the winter, barely. So the fact that the chargers downtown are broken means that we can't do that because you need to charge it if you want to go back home again. But it's a super cheap car. It provides the mobility that we need for 90% of our drives. And the only reason we bought it is because we've got 2 kids and I've got to take them to daycare. Our other car is a Chevy Bolt. Again, it was a $30,000 car. You get a tax credit for it. It's a travesty that they stopped producing it for a little while. And you can get these for these again, I pulled these at the beginning of the summer, but you can get them for really good prices now, used. And the batteries are, a little degraded, but they're fine. These Chevy Bolts with 20 some odd thousand miles on it is functionally a brand new car for 17 grand, and you're driving at half the cost. So increasingly, I think used EVs will be a thing, and they will be affordable, and people will want them because they're an affordable way to get around. And then this is the last thing, and this one drives me nuts. So people will say, oh, all the EVs, can the grid handle it? There are a lot of things that I'm worried about with our electric grid and the way that our regulatory models are set up. EVs are literally the last thing that I'm worried about. And the reason is that if you've got an EV with a 300-mile range on it, the average American drives 35 miles a day. You could charge that thing. You have plenty of flexibility as to when you would charge that thing. It is very rare that it's like, I have to charge it right now. And most of the costs of the grid are driven by peak demand. So the hottest days of the year when air conditioners are cranking all around New England. And as long as we avoid charging at those peak moments, you're not increasing the cost of the grid. You're just making it so that some of the power plants that we're already running are just running a little more. And the way electricity rates work is that you've got fixed costs and you've got sales, and you're dividing those fixed costs out over the sales. So if we have more sales over the same fixed costs, you're actually lowering the cost of electricity. So I am not worried about that particular issue. And if you want, this is the citation that shows that this is actually happening already, is that EV adoption is tending to drive down electricity rates. And then here's the last one, which I think, do I have another slide? Okay, yeah. So the last one is, who has heard, so that you're actually in the home of vehicle to grid here in the Granite State. So has anyone heard of vehicle to grid? A couple. Okay. So vehicle to grid is the idea that and actually the 2013 Nissan Leaf was already equipped to do this. As one of the few cars that was at the time. Vehicle to grid is the idea that you can plug your car in, and then when the grid needs that power on those hot days when the air conditioners are running all around New England, it can draw down your EV and you can get paid for it. So the New Hampshire Electric Co-op did a pilot of this idea where all they were doing was passing along their avoided costs to, and it was Plymouth State that did this. They had 2 Nissan Leafs that were running the pilot. And the payments that the university was getting were more than enough to pay for the lease payment of the Nissan Leaf. So you'll have people say like, oh, I don't know, are people going to want to do this? And it's like, well, if you pay someone, $1,400 to tap, 10% of their battery a couple days per year, I'm pretty sure that you'll have some people signing up for it. And again, like once you've driven an EV for a while, you barely ever need the full battery on a given day. So, okay, so what is the problem with EVs, right? So this is a mine. Anyone care? Guess what was being mined in this mine? Coal. This is a coal mine. So there's a mountaintop removal mine in, sorry, that was a gotcha question. I can't help to do it. Lithium extraction is a problem, as well as the extraction of all the other minerals that go into all the other parts of the battery. But as someone I like to quote on this has said, if you didn't grow it, it came from a mine. So look around you. Absolutely everything in this room that is not organic in some way or another came from underground at some point. The chairs you're sitting on, this carpet, this podium, all of these are petroleum byproducts. We have to remember that when we are transitioning to electric vehicles, we're not just starting to mine lithium. We're also not mining the fossil fuels that are powering the vehicles that we were using previously. And in particular, the one that creates the fossil fuel that creates the largest mining burden is coal. And so the more quickly that we move away from coal, the less mineral extraction that we're going to be doing globally. Period. And this is the 2 scenarios that you've got on this slide, is that you've got the potential to create a circular economy with these batteries. And if you think that that's Pollyanna, I would posit actually that what I'm seeing from the recycling industry is actually the opposite. We currently have too many battery recycling startups and not enough batteries. And so my forecast is that we're going to see a bunch of battery recycling startups going bankrupt in the next couple of years because they've gotten out ahead of the demand of the batteries that we're creating. So I actually think it's a really reasonable bet that we're going to end up much more like the second graph in this slide. And it's backed up by the fact that if you look at lead acid batteries, 98% of those are recycled today. And I think you'll see a very similar circular economy start to create itself with lithium batteries, which means that we'll have lithium mining rising for a time to meet the demand of more electric vehicles, as well as more grid scale storage. And then at a certain point, it'll level off because we're starting to just recycle the existing batteries, as well as create more efficient batteries that require less lithium. So that's my forecast out through 2050. Okay, so this is the last solution that is ready to go now. And it's net zero home. So these and again, sort of to go back to the first slide, energy efficiency is the least cost resource, and it's the thing we should be pursuing now. So if anyone is building new now, if they're not considering a highly efficient home, they're leaving money on the table. So this is a development of 26 net zero duplexes. They just broke ground on it earlier this summer. It's down in Hudson, New Hampshire. Barrett Hill is the name of the developer. The developer ran the numbers. He asked his realtor to send him her power bills. Her house is about the same square footage as the buildings this guy is making. She sent him the bills for their fuel oil and propane. And then he said, okay, so we're going to zero out those power bills on your average month. And yes, there's extra upfront cost to building a more energy efficient home, which is rolled into a mortgage. So you'll have a slightly higher mortgage payment. But if you compare energy bills plus mortgage payment of a traditional home to energy bills plus mortgage payment of a net zero home, you save $650 a month on the net zero home. And so this developer has made a bet that he's going to sell more houses by building them to net zero standards, and we're testing that bet as we speak. I live in one of these houses. I can tell you, I built it on a public radio reporter's salary, and anyone who tells you that they cost. So the New Hampshire home builders have been saying they cost $70,000 more per home to build one. That's false. We built it for $148 a square foot and a lot of sweat equity. So oh wait, this is that was the actual math. Excuse me, $143 a month less for a net zero home. Okay, so this is my sort of wrapping it all up slide, which is that the attacking the solutions is the strategy. So that is why you're hearing more and more folks who go after these solutions. We already have cost-effective solutions that we can take and run with now, today, and so there's no reason to wait for better technology. Although I think we will have better technology soon. And when it comes to how we should work towards that future, we can work on these solutions here locally. For those who don't know, New Hampshire has a 400-member House of Representatives. It is the legislative body in the world that has the lowest representative to representee ratio. And you can contact these people very quickly, and suddenly you have the levers of democracy at your fingertips when you develop that relationship with your local lawmaker. And so that's I think the thrust of it. How did I do on time? My watch is dead.
You're great.
Okay, great. And then this is like my sucker slide. There's our house, and that's my daughter. Just to show that, like, hey, look how nice the whiz bang future is. And so with that, I'm happy to take questions. Oh, and I'd be a bad executive director for a nonprofit if I did not say we survive on memberships and donations. And if anyone would like to become a member, we'd greatly appreciate your support. Comment is, it's too bad the New Hampshire Electric Co-op canceled their vehicle to grid program. And the way I phrase that as a question is, why did they? We did actually just have a presentation from the Electric Co-op about this. And I think it's a great example of this stuff is it's sort of like the devil's in the details of how you design your program. And what happened with the electric co-ops pilot is they were creating a real-time electricity price for an hourly price, essentially. So if you were to I unfortunately I can't pull it up on the screen, but there's the way the electricity markets work is there's a real-time auction every 5 minutes of every day of the year. And they set a real-time price of electricity based on the results of those auctions. And so the co-op was passing along those real-time prices in an hourly rate. And they were doing that the day before. So at 4 o'clock each day, they would send off a forecast of what the real-time price was going to be. And that's what you get paid for your vehicle to grid interaction. The problem was that they blew the forecast. And so a couple days of the year, they missed the really expensive hours of the day and they were overcompensating people. And so it's just a really good example of good in theory, but if you mess up the execution, the program doesn't pay for itself. And they had to go back to the drawing board. So again, I at the beginning said I'm going to present a really positive and optimistic presentation, but there are a lot of challenges between here and where we need to get to, and that's just one small example.
But it sounds like if they screwed up on their design and calculations, why would they cancel? Why don't they just do the calculations
better? A great question. And we're hopeful that they'll come back, because it was a pilot. We're hopeful that they'll come back with a different design in the near future. We're working on that right now. There's an outfit called the Grid Modernization Advisory Group, which is a statewide committee that talks about these things. It's where they presented about their rate. And we're currently talking about how those types of programs could be rolled out statewide and what a good design would look like. It's just a question of settling on what does a good design look like.
We have a question here in the room. There's one and two.
Yeah, 5, but I'll start.
Okay, well, why don't we do one and then we'll take one from Zoom and then we can go back.
It's very fascinating that Hampshire is not only a donut hole for DC fast chargers. Yeah. But also that it's a donut hole for advocacy. It's one of the best things to learn today. Particularly fascinating that some of the donut hole has been filled in at Berwyn Motors in Coney. They recently put in 4 Blink fast chargers of 50 kW or more. The only downside is they're charging 69 cents a kilowatt hour, so the privilege of they're very expensive. Yeah. Meanwhile, the dealer still has his regular 8 kW chargers that are free.
Yeah.
So you can stop by them. That bodes somewhat well going in the dark. Now, if you could get Tilton and the chargers from Volta to be reworking again, but they had offered a free 30 minutes, so you come by and go shop at the stores and your outlets to work again. That would be wonderful. Any progress on that front is a question.
So I don't know what's specifically going on with the Volta chargers at Tilton, and it's funny. I've charged there too, so I'd be curious to know. But generally speaking, the problem with fast chargers and charging infrastructure in New Hampshire right now is, one, there are no state programs, so we're almost entirely relying. Excuse me, there are minimal state programs.
It's a big state program. It's not being done.
Well, so there's $5 million from the Volkswagen Mitigation Trust Fund, which is the Dieselgate money when Volkswagen lied on their emission standards. New Hampshire got we got a big payout. I can't remember what the full payout was, but $5 million was set aside for EV charging. It's very slowly trickling out the door. We've seen a few chargers get built with that money. There's also $17 million from the bipartisan infrastructure law in what's called the NEVI program, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, and we've had 5 sites win awards through that program that are going to start getting built right now. So it's happening very, very slowly. But there's no. So in other states, the utilities have what are called make-ready programs, where they essentially say, we'll meet you halfway. We will invest in the poles and the infrastructure and the wires, and then as soon as we get to the point where we hand off at the plug, then you have to pay for everything else. New Hampshire's regulators have said no, and have denied those programs in the state of New Hampshire.
Having to charge.
Right, which and the demand charge, this gets really nerdy, so I'm gonna just say it. The demand charge structure, the way the electricity rates are structured is punitive towards fast chargers in particular. So they have to charge really high rates to recoup the cost.
Your optimism is admirable. My optimism comes when I go to the ISO New England app, which you should all find.
Which is what I was gonna pull up, which we can't do.
Which they've gotten around to figuring out, gee, people are producing solar behind the meter. And we need to know how much that is, so we need to know what's left that we have to do. And the really nice thing about it is that today, there was 5 gigawatts of behind the meter solar out of a total of a 15 gigawatt demand.
Yeah.
So the people with houses with solar on them are providing a third of the electricity during the daytime. And it even extends into the evening slightly to the point where the behind the meter solar is both reducing the peak and delaying.
Yeah.
So I'm very optimistic that that's gonna be doubling and doubling again to in the daytime, electricity will essentially be free. And you'll charge your electric cars. Do you have a similar viewpoint on that?
I do, yeah, and the real challenge there is that we need to create some sort of way for your average consumer to get that price signal. And currently that doesn't exist.
Well, that metering covers, 3/4 of it.
Yeah, but
What we really should be getting is all the additional benefit of
Yes.
reducing the peaks,
Yes.
balancing loads, et cetera, et cetera. And
Yeah.
we're not getting that, so I appreciate that you're.
Well, and the crux there is Eversource in particular does not have the metering infrastructure to do that type of an electric bill that varies by time.
That brings me to my third.
Oh, I'm gonna have this question from the Zoom chat, and then we can come back. So the question in the chat is, what is the most important energy policy that you would like the legislature to pass for New Hampshire?
That's a great question. I'm gonna answer the question, but then I'm also gonna dodge. I would say that if you could pass one bill, the bill you should pass is very similar to what has been passed in other states, which is to set economy-wide binding targets for greenhouse gas emissions. And what that would do is it would focus everyone's attention on, okay, like, here's the target we have to hit. And all of the state agencies, all of the companies, everyone who's engaged in emitting carbon would have to come up with some sort of plan for how to hit those targets. And if they failed to, they'd be liable, and citizens would be able to bring a lawsuit and hold their feet to the fire. So that's what's driving progress in Maine and Massachusetts in particular. But I will say that's not the kind of bill that Clean Energy New Hampshire works on, because when I look at the political landscape, because of our political maps, I think there's going to be a Republican control of the state Senate until at least 2030. And I think that's going to preclude that type of a really big sweeping bill. And so instead we work on bite-sized changes that will alleviate sort of specific problems. The one right now, so I mentioned there's 500 megawatts of solar trying to get built in the state of New Hampshire. What's stopping that from happening is the utilities interconnection process. So we got a bill passed last year that's going to require the passage, the creation of rules that will govern that process. And they will have binding timelines the utilities have to stick to, and those rules are going to get written shortly. The rulemaking is going to open this month.
Just to clarify, that 500 megawatts is basically large systems.
No, DG.
No,
so it's 5 megawatts and under.
Yeah, that's large.
But it includes your yes, it includes your 5 kilowatt.
My point is there is no queue for residential systems.
There is.
Essentially, you're connected within a couple of months.
There is still a queue. It's a different interconnection process, but I don't want to argue about this but we can talk about it offline if you want.
Okay, let's pause for a second. Is there anyone else? We're just about 5 o'clock. I know some of you might have other classes to get to. Are there other questions? Yeah, in the back there?
I was just wondering,
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm happy to share it, and it's not posted anywhere, but certainly I'm happy to share it.
Third question.
So this will be the last one and then we'll wrap up. Okay.
Net metering. Okay. My home, so I've had it for 8 years, and it's under the original net metering, which is kilowatt hour for kilowatt hour.
Yep.
I've stored up a bank of about 25,000 kilowatt hours, which they were paying me in pittance for.
Yes.
3 cents instead of 30 cents.
Yeah.
They charge me. We just had a fire caused by squirrels. We hit it through into my attic and then went back out to the solar system and not through some of the wires. Fortunately, my insurance companies paid for the removal, rebuild the roof, and put the system back to for less money than it costs to just do the installation part of the system. The hard part is it's taken me 6 months to recover from the utility company pulling the meter during the fire. It took about a month to get it plugged back in. My new solar was up and running, but to get the billing straightened around to where I was back on the original thing, which is finally happened, took forever and lots of phone calls. So the question is, what can you do about making this so much easier than it is at the current time? Good news is the insurance paid for it, so I'm getting my same payback as before. We finally got back on.
Yeah.
But it's always just pushing a road with
Yeah.
all these people.
So those interconnection rules that we're gonna commence in the next month would specifically deal with exactly that type of problem. And so when I said there is an interconnection queue at the residential level, that's what I mean, is that they line you up and they say, we got this request, and we're at some point gonna have to go out and do meter swaps for all of these people. That's the queue. And it's a different queue than folks who are doing an interconnection impact study at the 5 megawatt level, but there is still a queue, and we are going to have timelines that the utilities will be held to in law. And that's what's,
What do you think the average time is right now?
that's a great question I don't know the answer to. And in fact, we're going to be able to get the answer to that question from Eversource in the current docket at the
We guess
PUC.
that it's not under a week,
Uh,
and we guess that it's not over a year.
yeah, so, yeah.
A lot of solar companies would be unhappy.
yeah,
So it's gotta be in the months level.
What I can tell you is that in 2022 and 2023, there was a huge spike in people requesting interconnection. And at the residential level, the time for interconnection and meter swap out did stretch to at times 6 to 8 months. But generally speaking, what I've heard from our residential solar installers is that they're able to get meter swaps within a month.
No kidding.
Yeah, but
That's
that's,
within the usual just getting billed.
yeah, like I said, I don't want to argue with you about this.
All right, well, thank you all for joining us in person and on Zoom. Sam, thank you for your time. As I said at the beginning, this event today was part of our Spotlight on Humanities and Sustainability Studies. Our next event will be 1 week from today in the same room at 4 o'clock. So be sure to come back and join us. And again, if you haven't had a chance to, be sure to check out the exhibition before it closes. And as the director of a piece of a a not-for-profit part of a bigger institution, I would also be remiss in not mentioning that we are member supported as well. So if you are, thank you those of you who are members who are here in person and on Zoom. And if you aren't already, please consider joining us. Thomas has put a link in the chat, and there are paper forms in the back for people in person to a short survey. Let us know what you thought about today's program, things you'd like to know more about, and we hope to see you next week or on Saturday 1 to 3 to see Annette and their demonstrations. So thank you again.